Your sister is successful and responsible, unlike you," my father Raymond announced during dinner, raising his wine glass toward Isabella. "She doesn't need help from anyone." I sat there at the dining table in our family home in Denver, Colorado, feeling the familiar sting of his words. The candlelight flickered across Isabella's smug smile as she basked in Raymond's praise. She looked stunning as always, her designer blouse perfectly coordinated with her expensive jewelry. Everything about her screamed success. "Isabella climbed the corporate ladder through hard work, unlike your freelance dabbling," Raymond continued, his voice filled with pride. "Look at her apartment, her car, her wardrobe. She's completely self-reliant." I quietly cut into my roast chicken, keeping my expression neutral. 2 years of these dinner conversations had taught me to stay silent, while Raymond celebrated Isabella's supposed achievements and dismissed my work as worthless computer games. "She's making real money in retail management," he went on. "Not like Hannah, sitting at home playing around on computers all day." Isabella beamed at the comparison. "Thank you, Dad. I've worked really hard to get where I am. It feels amazing to be financially independent." I nearly choked on my water. Financially independent? The woman who had begged me for $4,000 just last week for her credit card payments? "Excellent," I said quietly, setting down my fork. "Then she won't need my $4,000 monthly support anymore." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Isabella's confident smile disappeared instantly, replaced by a look of panic. Raymond stopped mid-chew, his eyebrows furrowing in confusion. "What did you just say?" he asked slowly. "I said Isabella won't need my monthly transfers anymore since she's so successful and independent." I kept my voice calm, watching my sister's face drain of color. Isabella's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She had spent 2 years building this image of corporate success while secretly living off my earnings. Now her carefully constructed facade was crumbling with just one sentence. "Hannah, we agreed to keep that private," Isabella whispered desperately, her voice barely audible. "Keep what private?" Raymond demanded, looking between us with growing alarm. The room felt charged with tension. I could see Isabella calculating how much she had to lose if the truth came out. Her entire identity as the successful daughter, the one Raymond was proud of, the one who didn't need family help, was about to shatter. This was the moment I had been unconsciously waiting for. 2 years of being dismissed, 2 years of watching Isabella take credit for a lifestyle I was funding, 2 years of Raymond's constant criticism of my work. The golden child was about to fall from her pedestal, and I was the one holding the rope. My name is Hannah Martinez, and I'm 32 years old. For the past 4 years, I've been running a successful e-commerce business from my modest apartment in downtown Denver. While my family sees me as an underachiever who plays around on computers, I've quietly built an empire selling specialty outdoor gear through multiple online platforms. My business, which I call Mountain Peak Essentials, started small, but has grown beyond my wildest dreams. I source high-quality hiking and camping equipment from manufacturers across the country and sell them through my own website, Amazon, and several other platforms. Last year alone, I generated $750,000 in revenue. My profit margins are healthy, and my customer reviews consistently rate 5 stars. The irony isn't lost on me. While Raymond dismisses my computer dabbling, I make more in a month than most people see in a year. But I've always been private about my success. I dress simply, drive a reliable Honda Civic, and live below my means. Money has never been about status for me. Isabella, on the other hand, has always been about appearances. At 28, she works as a retail manager at a high-end clothing store in Cherry Creek, earning around $45,000 annually. It's a respectable job, but hardly the executive position Raymond believes she holds. 2 years ago, Isabella came to me in tears. She had racked up enormous credit card debt trying to maintain a lifestyle she couldn't afford. The apartment she rented was bleeding her dry, Her car payments were astronomical, and she was drowning in designer purchases she had made to keep up with her wealthy friends. "I'll pay you back, I promise," she had begged. "I just need help until I get promoted. I can't let Dad know I'm struggling." Being the older sister, I felt protective. I agreed to transfer $4,000 monthly to cover her shortfalls, with the understanding that it would be temporary. Isabella promised she would use the time to get her finances in order and eventually become truly independent. Instead, she used my money to fund an even more extravagant lifestyle. She moved to a luxury apartment, bought expensive clothes, and started posting on social media about her successful career. She convinced our extended family that she was thriving in corporate America while carefully hiding the truth about where her money really came from. Meanwhile, Raymond continued his pattern of comparing us during every family gathering. He would praise Isabella's independence and business acumen while dismissing my work as a hobby. He genuinely believed that Isabella's retail management position was more valuable than my thriving online business. "Hannah needs to get a real job," he would say to relatives. "Isabella is the responsible one. She's making something of herself." The worst part was watching Isabella nod along with these comparisons, never once acknowledging that her entire lifestyle was subsidized by the sister Raymond constantly criticized. She had become comfortable with the lie, comfortable with letting me fund her image while taking all the credit. Tonight's dinner was supposed to be another celebration of Isabella's latest promotion at work. Instead, it was about to become the night when the truth finally came out. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. Raymond set down his fork and stared at me with the expression he usually reserved for discussing my disappointing life choices. "Hannah, explain what you mean by monthly transfers," he said slowly. Isabella shot me a desperate look across the table. "Dad, it's not what it sounds like," she began, but her voice lacked conviction. $4,000, I repeated clearly. "Every month for the past 2 years. $96,000 total to cover Isabella's rent, car payments, credit cards, and shopping habits." Raymond's face went through several color changes, from confusion to disbelief to something approaching anger. "That's impossible. Isabella makes good money at her management position. She makes $45,000 a year managing a clothing store," I said matter-of-factly. "Which is a perfectly respectable salary, but not nearly enough to support the lifestyle she's been living." "Hannah, please stop," Isabella whispered, tears starting to form in her eyes. But I was done protecting her image. Her luxury apartment costs $2,800 a month. Her car payment is $600. Add in utilities, insurance, credit card minimums, and daily expenses, and she's been short about $4,000 monthly to maintain the standard of living Dad has been praising. Raymond looked at Isabella with growing horror. "Is this true?" Isabella's carefully applied makeup was starting to run as tears rolled down her cheeks. "I was going to pay her back. I just needed time to get established." "Established in what?" Raymond demanded. "You told me you were promoted to district manager last year." "I oversee 3 sales associates," Isabella admitted quietly. "It's not really district management." The truth was finally spilling out. For 2 years, Isabella had been crafting elaborate stories about her career advancement, creating fictional promotions and salary increases that existed only in her imagination and Raymond's proud retellings to friends and neighbors. "So while I've been telling everyone how successful you are, how independent you are, you've been living off your sister's charity." Raymond's voice was rising. "It wasn't charity," Isabella protested weakly. "It was a loan. A loan with no repayment terms, no interest, and no end date," I corrected. "A loan you never mentioned when you were letting Dad use me as a cautionary tale about responsibility and success." Raymond turned to me with a look I had never seen before. It wasn't his usual disappointment or dismissive irritation. It was something closer to shame. "How much money do you actually make with your computer work?" he asked quietly. I had never planned to reveal this information, but the moment seemed right. Last year, I grossed $750,000 through my e-commerce business. After expenses and taxes, I cleared about $400,000. The number hit Raymond like a physical blow. He sat back in his chair, staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. Isabella was crying openly now, realizing that her secret was completely exposed, and her image as the successful daughter was permanently destroyed. Raymond's wine glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against his dinner plate. The sound echoed through our suddenly too quiet dining room as he processed what I had just revealed. 750,000, he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. That's gross revenue, I clarified. My net profit was around 400,000, but yes. Isabella was hyperventilating at the other end of the table. Hannah, you can't cut me off now. My rent is due in 5 days. I have credit card payments, car insurance, my gym membership. Maybe you should have thought about that before spending 2 years letting Dad believe you were more successful than me, I replied calmly, pulling out my phone. I'm canceling the automatic transfer right now. My fingers moved across the banking app with practiced ease. With a few taps, I deleted the recurring $4,000 monthly transfer that had been funding Isabella's fake lifestyle. There, I said, showing her the screen. Transfer canceled. Raymond was staring at me like I had grown a second head. You make more in a year than I made as a high school principal in 5 years, and you've been sitting here letting me lecture you about responsibility? You never asked about my income, I pointed out. You just assumed that because I work from home, I must be unsuccessful. Isabella suddenly stood up, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Dad, you have to make her keep helping me. I'll lose my apartment. Sit down, Isabella, Raymond said sharply, his tone cutting through her panic. You've been lying to me for 2 years. I wasn't lying exactly, she protested. I was just managing the narrative. Managing the narrative? Raymond's voice dripped with disgust. You told me last Christmas that you got a $15,000 bonus for exceeding sales targets. Isabella's face crumpled. I knew you'd be disappointed if you found out I was struggling. So instead, you let me believe Hannah was the family disappointment while she was literally paying for your life. Raymond stood up, his own chair joining the chaos. Do you have any idea how many times I've told people that Hannah needs to get her act together? How many times I've used Isabella as an example of what Hannah should aspire to be? The irony was almost funny. While Raymond was holding up Isabella as the model of success and independence, she had been entirely dependent on my financial support. Every designer outfit he praised, every luxury she flaunted, every achievement he celebrated had been purchased with money from my supposedly worthless business. Hannah, I need you to reconsider, Isabella pleaded, moving around the table toward me. I'll pay you back with interest. I'll get a second job. I'll do whatever you want. What I want, I said, standing up to face her, is for you to stop pretending to be something you're not. What I want is for Dad to stop using you as proof that I'm a failure. What I want is honesty. Isabella's perfectly styled facade was cracking. Her expensive makeup was streaking down her face, and her designer blouse was wrinkled from stress. For the first time in years, she looked like what she actually was, a 28-year-old retail worker living beyond her means. But Dad thinks I'm successful, she whispered desperately. Dad thought you were successful, I corrected. Now he knows the truth. Raymond was pacing the length of the dining room, running his hands through his graying hair. 2 years, he muttered. 2 years of bragging about Isabella's corporate climb while dismissing Hannah's business as a hobby. It's not a hobby when it pays better than most corporate executives, I said quietly. He stopped pacing and looked at me with something that might have been respect. What exactly do you sell? Outdoor gear, I replied. Hiking equipment, camping supplies, specialized clothing. I have relationships with manufacturers across the country and distribute through multiple online channels. My customer base is primarily adventure enthusiasts who appreciate quality equipment and excellent service. Raymond blinked slowly. And this generates $750,000 annually. More some years, less others. But consistently profitable? Yes. Isabella was still crying, but now her tears had taken on a different quality. These weren't tears of panic about being discovered. These were tears of genuine grief for the life she was about to lose. "I need specifics about your business," Raymond said, settling back into his chair with a new intensity. "I want to understand exactly what I've been dismissing all these years." Isabella looked between us with growing desperation. She was realizing that Raymond's attention had completely shifted away from her crisis and toward understanding my success. "I started Mountain Peak Essentials 4 years ago," I began. "I noticed a gap in the market for high-quality outdoor gear that wasn't outrageously expensive. Most camping equipment is either cheap garbage that breaks after one trip, or luxury items priced for trust fund kids." Raymond leaned forward, actually listening to me for perhaps the first time in my adult life. "So I researched manufacturers, built relationships with suppliers who produce equipment for major brands, but also do private label work. I created my own line of products that match the quality of premium brands at roughly 60% of their retail price." And people actually buy this stuff online?" Raymond asked. "Dad, camping and hiking are massive industries," I explained. "People spend billions of dollars annually on outdoor recreation. The problem is that most gear companies focus on extreme athletes or casual weekend warriors. I target serious enthusiasts who want professional-grade equipment but don't want to pay luxury prices." Isabella was scrolling frantically through her phone, probably calculating her monthly expenses, and realizing how quickly her world was about to collapse. "My average order value is around $250, I continued. "I process roughly 1,200 orders per month across all platforms. My gross margin runs about 40% after product costs, but before marketing and overhead." Raymond was doing math in his head. 1,200 orders times 250 is 300,000 monthly. Times 12 months, 3.6 million in gross revenue, I finished. "But that's been my peak year. I told you last year's numbers, which were more typical." The magnitude of my business was finally sinking in. Raymond had spent years treating me like an unemployed college graduate playing video games in my apartment, when I was actually running a multi-million-dollar operation. "Where do you work from?" he asked. "My apartment has a dedicated office space, but most of the logistics are handled through third-party fulfillment. I manage inventory planning, vendor relationships, marketing, customer service, and financial planning. The physical shipping happens through a warehouse in Commerce City." Isabella suddenly looked up from her phone with panic in her eyes. "Hannah, my credit card minimum payments alone are $1,800 a month. Without your transfers, I can't even make the minimums." "Maybe you shouldn't have bought so much designer clothing," I suggested. "Or maybe you should have been honest about your situation instead of building a lie that required constant financial support." "But what am I supposed to tell people?" Isabella wailed. "Everyone thinks I'm successful." "Tell them the truth," Raymond said harshly. "Tell them you've been living a lie funded by the sister you and I both dismissed as unsuccessful." The weight of the revelation was clearly affecting him. Every conversation we had ever had about my career was being recontextualized. Every time he had criticized my work choices, every time he had held up Isabella as an example, every time he had suggested I get a real job was now revealed as ignorant and hurtful. "I need to call your Aunt Jennifer," Raymond said suddenly. "Why?" Isabella asked with dread. "Because last month I told her that Hannah should follow Isabella's example and find a traditional career path. I told her that Isabella's retail management position was proof that traditional employment was more stable than entrepreneurship. My Aunt Jennifer, Raymond's sister, was a successful real estate developer who had always been supportive of my unconventional career path. She had probably held her tongue when Raymond made those comments, but she must have known how misguided his perspective was. Isabella was spiraling into full panic mode. She had pulled out her laptop and was frantically searching for apartments she could actually afford on her retail salary. "Look at this," she said, showing us a studio apartment listing. 600 square feet for $1,500 a month, and it doesn't even have a dishwasher. "Welcome to living within your means," I replied without sympathy. Raymond was still processing the business details, Hannah, when you said you work from home, I pictured you in pajamas browsing social media. I never imagined you were running a legitimate operation. That's because you never asked, I pointed out. Every time I tried to explain what I'd do, you would interrupt with advice about getting a traditional job. He had the decency to look ashamed. I thought I was helping. I thought I was encouraging you to be more like Isabella. More like Isabella, I repeated. You mean more like someone who lies about their income, lives entirely on credit, and depends on family handouts while pretending to be independent? Isabella slammed her laptop shut. I wasn't trying to hurt you, Hannah. I was just trying to make Dad proud. By using me as the family disappointment while living off my success? The anger I had been suppressing for 2 years was finally coming out. Do you know how many family gatherings I've sat through listening to lectures about responsibility and work ethic while funding your entire lifestyle? Raymond stood up abruptly and walked to the window overlooking our neighborhood. I owe you an apology, Hannah. A massive apology. It's not just about apologizing, I said. It's about recognizing that your assumptions about success and failure were completely wrong. Isabella's traditional job title impressed you more than my actual financial achievement. But her job seemed more... He paused, searching for the right word. More legitimate? I suggested. More respectable? More like what you understand? He nodded reluctantly. That's the problem, Dad. You valued the appearance of success over actual success. Isabella had a corporate-sounding title and wore business clothes, so you assumed she was thriving. I work from home in comfortable clothes, so you assumed I was failing. Isabella was crying again, but this time the tears seemed more genuine. I never wanted it to go this far. I thought I would get promoted or find a higher-paying job and eventually be able to stop needing your help. For 2 years? I asked skeptically. I kept thinking next quarter would be better, or next year. I kept thinking something would change. The only thing that changed was your spending, I pointed out. Instead of using my support to get stable, you used it to justify spending even more. Raymond returned to the table and sat down heavily. What happens now? Now Isabella figures out how to live on her actual salary, I said. And maybe both of you stop treating my career like a cute hobby that I'll eventually outgrow. And what about the money Isabella owes you? Raymond asked. I had been thinking about this question for months. I consider it an expensive lesson. I'm not expecting repayment, but I'm also not providing any more support. Isabella looked up with hope in her eyes. So, you're not angry about the money? I'm angry about the lying, I clarified. I'm angry about being used as the family cautionary tale while funding the very lifestyle Dad was praising you for. The money was my choice to give, but the deception wasn't acceptable. Raymond was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was different than I had ever heard it. Hannah, I would like to learn more about your business. Not to criticize or suggest changes, but because I clearly don't understand what you've accomplished, and I'd like to. For the first time all evening, I smiled. 3 weeks later, I sat in my home office watching my bank account grow instead of shrink by $4,000. The money I had been sending to Isabella was now being reinvested into expanding my business internationally, and the results were already showing. Isabella had moved into a modest 1-bedroom apartment 15 minutes from her retail job. She had sold most of her designer clothing and jewelry to cover her credit card payments, and I had heard through Raymond that she was working extra shifts to make ends meet. The most satisfying part wasn't watching Isabella struggle with reality. It was watching Raymond come to terms with how wrong he had been about both of us. He had called me every few days since our dinner confrontation, asking detailed questions about my business operations. Not critical questions or suggestions for improvement, but genuine curiosity about how I had built something successful, while he was dismissing it as worthless. I told Jennifer about your real revenue numbers, he admitted during one of our calls. She laughed at me for 20 minutes straight. Aunt Jennifer always knew you were underestimating me, I replied. She said she tried to tell me several times, but I wouldn't listen. Raymond's voice carried a weight of regret. She said I was being an arrogant fool who couldn't recognize success because it didn't look like what I expected. That sounded exactly like something Jennifer would say. She had never been shy about calling out family members when they were being ridiculous. The worst part, Raymond continued, is realizing how many people I told that Isabella was the responsible one, and you needed to get your act together. I was bragging about her corporate success to everyone. And now? Now I have to figure out how to explain that everything I said was wrong, that the daughter I was criticizing was actually more successful than I ever dreamed, and the daughter I was praising was living in a fantasy funded by her sister's generosity. The reversal was complete. Raymond's entire understanding of his daughters had been flipped upside down, and he was struggling to reconcile his assumptions with reality. The most dramatic consequence came when Isabella's carefully constructed social media presence began to crumble. She had built an enormous following by posting photos of her luxury lifestyle, her designer outfits, and her expensive apartment. Her social media fed the narrative that she was a successful young professional living her best life. Without my financial support, that content stream dried up immediately. She could no longer afford the designer pieces that had been central to her online image. Her luxury apartment was gone, replaced by a modest space that didn't photograph well. Her expensive dinners and shopping trips became memories. Her followers began to notice. Comments on her posts shifted from admiration to concern. "Where have you been? Are you okay? Your content has really changed lately." Isabella tried to maintain the facade for a few weeks, posting throwback photos and recycling older content. But eventually, people started asking direct questions about her apparent lifestyle change. The final blow came when one of her former coworkers, someone she had probably bragged to about her corporate success, commented publicly asking about her big promotion that never seemed to have happened. Isabella's social media presence, which had been built entirely on the lie of her financial success, became impossible to maintain once the truth was revealed. She eventually made her accounts private and stopped posting altogether. Meanwhile, Raymond had begun telling people the truth about my business success. It was awkward for him, having to explain that he had been wrong about both of his daughters for years. But he seemed committed to making up for his mistakes by giving me the recognition I had earned. "I'm proud of what you built," he told me during one of our conversations. "I'm ashamed that I couldn't see it when it was right in front of me." Those words meant more to me than all the money I had ever made. Isabella's transition back to reality proved more brutal than anyone anticipated. Within 6 months of losing my financial support, she had been forced to declare bankruptcy, unable to manage the credit card debt she had accumulated while living far beyond her means. The luxury apartment, designer wardrobe, and expensive car were all repossessed or sold, leaving her with barely enough furniture for her small studio apartment. Her social media followers, who had admired her seemingly glamorous lifestyle, began to distance themselves once they realized her success had been entirely fabricated. Former friends stopped inviting her to expensive social events she could no longer afford, and dating became complicated when potential partners expected the affluent woman her online presence had portrayed. Raymond faced his own social embarrassment when family members and neighbors learned that he had spent years criticizing his actually successful daughter while praising the one who had been living on borrowed money and borrowed time, forcing him to confront not only his favoritism, but also his fundamental misunderstanding of what constituted real achievement versus mere appearance. As I reinvested the recovered $4,000 monthly into expanding Mountain Peak Essentials into European markets, I realized that Raymond's years of dismissive comments had inadvertently become the fuel for my determination to prove that success comes in many forms, not just the traditional paths he understood and valued. The greatest victory wasn't watching Isabella face the consequences of her deception, but rather witnessing Raymond finally recognize and respect the business empire I had built while he was looking the other way, teaching me that sometimes the most satisfying revenge is simply allowing the truth to speak louder than the lies that once defined you. Dad's retiring. The company's mine now. Bradley Morrison announced while settling himself into my executive chair like he belonged there. He'd already started giving orders to my team, his voice carrying that entitled tone I'd grown to despise over the past 6 months. My name is Juliana Hayes, and I'm the Chief Financial Officer at Morrison Industries, a mid-sized manufacturing company based in Columbus, Ohio. At 42 years old, I've spent 15 years climbing the corporate ladder through hard work and dedication, not through family connections. Unlike Bradley, who at 35 still acted like a spoiled child despite his MBA from an expensive private school. I stood in the doorway of my own office, watching this theatrical performance unfold. Bradley had positioned himself behind my mahogany desk, already rifling through confidential financial documents that he had no legal right to access. His expensive suit couldn't hide the smugness radiating from every gesture as he picked up my personal coffee mug and took a sip. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice level despite the rage building inside me. "This is my office." Bradley looked up with mock surprise, as if he'd just noticed me standing there. "Oh, Juliana, good timing. I was about to call you in." He gestured to the chair across from my own desk, the chair where clients typically sat. "Please, have a seat. We need to discuss the transition." The audacity was breathtaking. I'd been expecting something like this ever since Mr. Morrison's health scare 3 months ago, but seeing it happen still felt surreal. Bradley had been circling the company like a vulture, making increasingly bold moves to position himself as the heir apparent. The board meetings where he'd started showing up uninvited, the casual comments about family legacy, and the way he'd begun introducing himself to new clients as the future CEO. "Bradley," I said calmly, "your father hasn't made any official announcements about retirement. The board hasn't voted on succession planning. You can't just..." "Can't I?" He leaned back in my chair, fingers steepled like some corporate mastermind from a bad movie. "Look around, Juliana. This is a family business. Has been for 30 years. When Dad steps down, it goes to family. That's how these things work." Behind him, I could see my financial team through the glass walls, their faces a mixture of confusion and concern. Bradley had already started barking orders at them when I'd stepped out for my morning meeting with the auditors. Jennifer, my senior analyst, caught my eye and mouthed, "What do we do?" I gave her a subtle shake of my head, signaling her to stay calm. What Bradley didn't know was that I'd been quietly building a case against him for months. Those late nights he assumed I was working on quarterly reports. I'd been documenting his financial irregularities instead. The suspicious transactions, the shell companies, the missing funds. I had it all. And now, watching him claim ownership of a company he'd been systematically robbing, I knew the time had come to act. My journey at Morrison Industries began 15 years ago when I started as a junior accountant fresh out of Ohio State. Mr. Morrison himself had hired me, impressed by my attention to detail and my genuine passion for financial analysis. Back then, the company was smaller, more personal. Everyone knew everyone, and there was a real sense of family among the employees. Mr. Morrison treated me like a daughter, mentoring me through complex deals and trusting me with increasingly important responsibilities. When the previous CFO retired 5 years ago, he didn't hesitate to promote me over several external candidates with more experience. "Juliana understands this company's heart," he'd told the board. "She'll protect what we've built here." I took that responsibility seriously. Morrison Industries manufactured specialized industrial equipment, and our reputation for quality and reliability had taken decades to build. Our clients trusted us with multi-million-dollar projects, and I made sure every financial decision reflected our commitment to excellence. Bradley's relationship with the company had always been complicated. As the only son, everyone assumed he'd eventually take over, but Mr. Morrison had been reluctant to hand him real responsibility. Bradley would show up sporadically, fresh from another failed venture or extended European vacation, expecting to be given a corner office and an executive salary. His father would find him some project to work on, usually something isolated from core operations. The first red flags appeared about 8 months ago. I noticed unusual wire transfers. Modest amounts at first, maybe $10,000 or $15,000 going to vendors I didn't recognize. When I asked Bradley about them, since they were processed through his departmental budget, he'd wave me off with vague explanations about new supplier relationships and market research initiatives. But the amounts kept growing. 20,000 here, 30,000 there. The vendor names were generic, things like Midwest Business Solutions and Industrial Consulting Group. When I tried to verify these companies online, I found bare-bones websites with stock photos and minimal contact information. Classic shell companies. I started keeping detailed records, screenshots of wire transfers, copies of purchase orders, documentation of every suspicious transaction. I even hired a private investigator to trace some of the shell companies, and what I found made my blood run cold. They all traced back to Bradley through a web of limited liability companies and business partnerships. He was stealing from his own father's company. The monthly theft had escalated to over $200,000 by the time Mr. Morrison had his heart attack 3 months ago. While his father was in the hospital fighting for his life, Bradley was systematically draining the company's accounts. The man who claimed to love this business was destroying it from the inside. I'd been waiting for the right moment to expose him, gathering evidence and building an airtight case. I needed Bradley to make a move that would clearly demonstrate his intent to defraud the company on a larger scale. His announcement today, his assumption of control without proper authority, this was exactly what I'd been waiting for. Now, watching him rifle through confidential documents while making plans to restructure his company, I felt a cold satisfaction. Bradley had just handed me everything I needed to destroy him completely. The crucial setback came when Bradley called an impromptu meeting with my entire financial team. I watched through the glass walls of my office as he gathered them around the conference table, his body language screaming authority he didn't legally possess. "Listen up, everyone," Bradley announced, standing at the head of the table like he'd been leading meetings there for years. "There are going to be some changes around here. Big changes." I moved closer to the door, straining to hear every word. This was it. The moment Bradley would overplay his hand completely. "First thing," he continued, pulling out a leather portfolio that looked more expensive than most people's monthly salary. "We're restructuring the entire finance department. Juliana's been too conservative with our investments, too cautious with our growth strategy. We're leaving money on the table." Jennifer, my senior analyst who'd been with the company for 7 years, raised her hand tentatively. "Bradley, shouldn't we wait for your father's official announcement? And shouldn't Juliana be part of this conversation?" Bradley's expression darkened. "My father is stepping down for health reasons. The transition is happening whether Juliana likes it or not. And frankly, her resistance to change has been holding this company back for too long." The lies flowed so smoothly, I almost admired his confidence. Almost. "Second," he continued, "we're implementing new vendor relationships immediately. I've identified several consulting firms that can help us modernize our operations. We'll be moving significant funds to accelerate these partnerships." I felt my heart rate spike. He wasn't just claiming control. He was planning to expand his theft operation under the guise of corporate restructuring. The monthly $200,000 was apparently not enough for Bradley's lifestyle. "Tom," he pointed to our accounts payable manager, "I need you to process these authorizations today." He slid a stack of documents across the table. "Priority transfers, $700,000 to start." 700,000 in a single day. The scope of his greed was breathtaking. Tom looked uncomfortable, glancing toward my office. "Bradley, these amounts require CFO approval. Company policy states that any transfer over 50,000 needs Juliana's signature and board notification." "Not anymore," Bradley snapped. "Policy is changing. I'm authorizing these transfers under emergency executive powers during the leadership transition." Emergency executive powers. The phrase would have been laughable if it weren't so terrifying. Bradley was inventing authority that didn't exist, betting that people's respect for the Morrison name would override their adherence to proper procedures. But he'd made a critical mistake. Everything he'd just said was being recorded by the conference room's standard recording system, a system I'd discreetly activated when I saw him gathering my team. His claims of authority, his plans to move $700,000 to shell companies, his dismissal of board oversight, it was all being documented in real time. I stepped back into my office and quietly began packing my personal belongings. I'd heard enough. Bradley had just confessed to planning the largest single theft in company history, and he'd done it in front of witnesses while being recorded. The trap he'd been setting for himself over the past 8 months had finally snapped shut. I moved with deliberate calm, placing my personal items into a cardboard box while Bradley continued his hostile takeover in the conference room. My framed photo with Mr. Morrison at last year's company picnic, my Ohio State coffee mug, the small cactus plant that had survived 5 years of office fluorescent lighting. Each item went into the box with careful precision. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Bradley thought he was watching me admit defeat, packing up in surrender while he claimed his birthright. He had no idea I was loading ammunition. Through the glass wall, I could see him growing more animated, more confident with each passing minute. He'd moved to the whiteboard now, sketching out organizational charts that put him at the top of every decision-making process. My team looked increasingly uncomfortable, but they were trapped between loyalty to me and fear of antagonizing the boss's son. "The beauty of family business," Bradley was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the thin walls, "is that we can move fast. No endless committee meetings, no bureaucratic red tape. When I see an opportunity, we take it. That's how we're going to dominate this market." I pulled out my laptop and began the process I'd been preparing for months. First, I accessed my secure drive where I'd been storing evidence. Bank records showing the progression of fraudulent transfers from $15,000 8 months ago to $200,000 monthly now. Screenshots of shell company websites. Corporate registration documents revealing Bradley as the beneficial owner of multiple fake vendors. Email trails where he'd authorized payments to companies that existed only on paper. But the crown jewel was the forensic analysis I'd commissioned 3 weeks ago. I'd hired Rebecca Cross, one of the most respected financial investigators in Ohio, to trace Bradley's money trail. Her report was devastating. A 40-page document that laid out the entire embezzlement scheme with mathematical precision. Bradley had stolen $2.4 million over 8 months. The methodology was actually quite sophisticated for someone I'd always considered more spoiled than smart. He'd created a network of 5 shell companies, each with professional-looking websites and registered business addresses that led to mail forwarding services. The companies had names that sounded legitimate. Industrial Solutions Group, Midwest Manufacturing Consultants, Professional Services Alliance. He'd even filed proper tax documents for them, maintaining the illusion of legitimate business operations. The stolen money flowed through multiple bank accounts before ultimately landing in Bradley's personal accounts or being used to fund his lifestyle. The private investigator had documented expensive cars, luxury vacations, and a downtown penthouse apartment that Bradley's official salary couldn't possibly support. What made the scheme particularly damaging was its impact on Morrison Industries' financial health. The company had been struggling with cash flow issues for months, leading to delayed vendor payments and canceled expansion plans. Mr. Morrison had been worried about competitive pressures and market changes, never suspecting that his own son was bleeding the company dry. I drafted an email to the board of directors, attaching Rebecca's forensic report along with my own supplementary evidence. Every transaction, every forged signature, every fabricated invoice was documented with timestamps and supporting materials. I'd even included Bradley's recorded statements from today's meeting, where he'd explicitly planned to steal $700,000 more. The email was addressed to all 7 board members, including the independent directors who had no personal relationship with the Morrison family. I knew they would have to act swiftly once they saw the evidence. The company's survival depended on immediate intervention, but I didn't send it yet. I wanted Bradley to feel completely secure in his victory before I destroyed him. Through the conference room wall, I could see him wrapping up his presentation. My team members were nodding politely, but their body language screamed discomfort. They'd worked for me for years, trusted my leadership, and now they were being told to abandon established procedures by someone who'd never demonstrated any real business competence. "Questions?" Bradley asked, looking around the table with the confidence of someone who expected none. Jennifer raised her hand again. "What about the board approval for these transfers? Even with executive authority, don't we need—" "The board will rubber stamp whatever I recommend," Bradley cut her off. "This is still a family business, Jennifer. The Morrison name carries weight that supersedes bureaucratic formalities." Perfect. He was doubling down on his illegal authority claims, making it clear that he intended to bypass all oversight. I added this exchange to my notes, building an even stronger case for criminal charges. The major plot twist came when Bradley made an unexpected announcement that changed everything about my timeline for exposing him. "One more thing," he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone as he looked directly at my team through the glass wall separating us. "Effective immediately, we're implementing new financial controls. All department budgets will be reviewed and approved personally by me before any expenditures are authorized." I froze in the middle of closing my laptop. This wasn't just about stealing money anymore. Bradley was positioning himself to control every aspect of the company's finances. He was planning a complete takeover, not just embezzlement. Additionally, Bradley continued, and I could see him pulling out a thick legal document from his portfolio. "I'm announcing that Morrison Industries will be restructured as Morrison Holdings, with myself as Chief Executive Officer and President. My father will retain the honorary title of Chairman Emeritus, but all operational decisions will flow through me." The conference room went completely silent. Even from my office, I could feel the shock radiating from my team. This wasn't a gradual transition or a planned succession. It was a corporate coup. But then Bradley said something that made my blood turn to ice. "I've already filed the necessary paperwork with the state. The restructuring is legally binding as of this morning. All employee contracts now fall under the new corporate structure, which means anyone who doesn't support this transition is free to seek employment elsewhere." My mind raced. If Bradley had actually managed to file legal documents restructuring the company, he might have just pulled off the perfect crime. By changing the corporate structure, he could potentially legitimize his access to company funds and make it much harder to prove embezzlement. Theft from Morrison Industries could become authorized transfers within Morrison Holdings. I immediately opened a new browser window and searched the Ohio Secretary of State database. It took several minutes to navigate the system, but when I found what I was looking for, I nearly laughed out loud with relief. Bradley had indeed filed paperwork to create Morrison Holdings LLC, but the filing was fundamentally flawed. He'd listed himself as the sole managing member and had forged his father's signature on the Articles of Incorporation. Worse, he'd used the wrong corporate registration number for Morrison Industries, making the entire restructuring legally invalid. The man was not just a thief, he was an incompetent thief. But this discovery presented me with an unexpected opportunity. Bradley's fraudulent corporate filing was actually a separate federal crime. Document forgery, mail fraud, and illegal corporate restructuring carried serious penalties, possibly even more serious than the embezzlement charges I'd been building. I screenshot the filing documents and added them to my evidence folder. Rebecca's forensic report had been comprehensive, but this new information elevated the case from financial fraud to organized criminal activity. Bradley wasn't just stealing money. He was attempting to steal the entire company through fraudulent legal documents. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jennifer. "What do we do?" "He's demanding access to all account passwords and authorization codes." I quickly typed back, "Stall him. Tell him you need to verify the legal authority with the board first. Do not give him any access codes." This was escalating faster than I'd anticipated. Bradley's desperation was showing. He was trying to consolidate control before anyone could question his authority. But his aggressive timeline was actually working in my favor. The more illegal actions he took in a short period, the stronger the criminal case against him became. I revised my email to the board, adding the fraudulent corporate filing documents and emphasizing the urgent need for immediate action. Bradley wasn't just embezzling money. He was attempting a hostile takeover of the entire company through forged documents and manufactured authority. It was time to destroy him completely. The protagonist sets her plan in motion, but another unexpected complication arises. Bradley's desperation reaches new heights when he realizes he needs to move faster than planned. I was about to send my comprehensive email to the board when Bradley burst into my office without knocking, his face flushed with anger and something that looked like panic. "Why are you packing?" he demanded, his voice higher than usual. "And why haven't you instructed your team to begin processing the new vendor transfers?" I looked up from my laptop with deliberate calm, my finger hovering over the send button. "Because I don't work for you, Bradley, and neither does my team." His eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. My packed box, my closed laptop, my complete lack of deference to his assumed authority. For the first time since walking into my office, Bradley seemed to realize that I wasn't playing along with his fantasy. "You're fired," he said, trying to regain control of the conversation. "Security will escort you out." I almost smiled at his amateur mistake. "On whose authority?" "You've filed fraudulent documents, Bradley. Morrison Holdings doesn't legally exist, which means you have no authority to fire anyone." The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might faint. How did I know about your fake company filing?" I stood up, closing my laptop with a satisfying click. "Because I'm actually good at my job. Unlike someone who's been stealing $2.4 million and thinks nobody would notice." Bradley's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The exact number, 2.4 million, had clearly shocked him. He'd probably assumed his thefts were too small and scattered for anyone to track comprehensively. "That's impossible," he whispered. "You can't know that. Shell companies, Bradley, Industrial Solutions Group, Midwest Manufacturing Consultants, Professional Services Alliance." I recited the names of his fake companies like I was reading from a grocery list. 5 companies total, all registered to mail forwarding services, all receiving fraudulent payments authorized by you. His face went from pale to greenish. I could practically see his mind racing, trying to calculate how much evidence I might have and how much trouble he was in. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Even if you suspected something you couldn't prove." "Rebecca Cross," I interrupted. "Professional financial investigator, 40-page forensic report documenting every fraudulent transaction over the past 8 months. Bank records, corporate filings, money trails, forged signatures, everything." Bradley grabbed the back of my chair for support, his knees apparently no longer willing to hold his weight. The magnitude of his exposure was finally sinking in. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. "Money? A promotion? I can make this worth your while." Now I did smile. "What I want, Bradley, is justice and accountability, and for you to face the consequences of stealing from a company your father spent 30 years building." "You don't understand," he said desperately. "If this comes out, it destroys everything. The company, the family reputation, all of it. My father's life work." "No," I corrected him. "Your theft destroys everything. My job is to stop you before you steal even more." I picked up my laptop and moved toward the door. "The board will be receiving my complete report in about 30 seconds. I suggest you use that time to call a good criminal defense attorney, because you're going to need one." Bradley lunged forward, trying to grab my laptop, but I was already out the door. Behind me, I could hear him shouting something about company loyalty and family betrayal, but the words sounded distant and pathetic. As I walked past the conference room, I saw my team still sitting around the table, looking confused and worried. I gave Jennifer a small nod and hit send on my email to the board. The trap had been sprung. Now came the reckoning. I walked calmly to the elevator, my laptop bag slung over my shoulder, and my cardboard box balanced in my arms. Behind me, I could hear Bradley's voice rising in panic as he called someone, probably a lawyer. though I doubted any attorney could save him from what was coming. The elevator doors closed just as my phone started ringing. Board Chairman Douglas Westfield's name appeared on the screen. Juliana. His voice was tight with concern when I answered. I just received your email. Please tell me this isn't real. It's all documented, Mr. Westfield. Every transaction, every forged signature, every fake company. Bradley has stolen $2.4 million over 8 months, and this morning he tried to steal $700,000 more. A long pause. The recording you included? That's really him planning additional theft? Recorded 40 minutes ago in the conference room. He also filed fraudulent corporate documents this morning, attempting to restructure the company under his control without board approval or legal authority. Jesus Christ. I could hear papers rustling as Westfield reviewed the evidence. Juliana, we need an emergency board meeting immediately. Can you be available this afternoon? Of course. But Mr. Westfield, there's something else you should know. Bradley is in my office right now trying to authorize additional transfers. My team is stalling him, but he's desperate. If you're going to act, it needs to be today. I'm calling the police, Westfield said grimly. This is beyond board discipline. This is criminal fraud. Through the elevator's glass walls, I could see Morrison Industries' lobby, where I'd walked in as an excited junior accountant 15 years ago. Today, I was walking out as the person who'd saved the company from destruction. Mr. Westfield, I said as the elevator reached the ground floor. There's one more thing. I recommend you secure all financial systems immediately. Change passwords, freeze authorization codes, everything. Bradley is going to try to move money the moment he realizes what's happening. Already on it. And Juliana, thank you. You just saved this company. I drove to a coffee shop 3 blocks away and waited. It took exactly 22 minutes. The first sign was the police cars, 3 of them, including an unmarked detective vehicle, pulling into Morrison Industries' parking lot with lights flashing but no sirens. Through the shop window, I watched officers in business suits walk purposefully toward the building's main entrance. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. Police are here. Bradley's in handcuffs. I allowed myself a small smile as I sipped my coffee. The speed of law enforcement's response spoke to the seriousness of Bradley's crimes. Financial fraud involving millions of dollars and forged corporate documents wasn't something they treated lightly. 10 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time it was Rebecca Cross, the financial investigator. Juliana, I just got a call from the district attorney's office. They want my complete report for the prosecution. How did this move so fast? Bradley got greedy, I explained. He tried to steal $700,000 more this morning and claimed executive authority he doesn't have. The board had no choice but to act immediately. Smart timing on your part. By waiting until he overplayed his hand, you made the case ironclad. No jury will have sympathy for someone who stole from his own father's company while planning to steal even more. Through the coffee shop window, I could see a news van pulling into the Morrison Industries parking lot. Word was already spreading about the arrest of a prominent local businessman's son for embezzlement and fraud. My phone buzzed with another text, this time from Douglas Westfield. Emergency board meeting at 6 p.m. We need to discuss your role going forward. I finished my coffee and headed back to face whatever came next. Bradley's reign of theft was over, but the real work of rebuilding Morrison Industries was just beginning. Bradley Morrison faced federal charges for embezzlement, mail fraud, and filing false corporate documents, ultimately receiving a 7-year prison sentence and being ordered to pay $2.4 million in restitution to Morrison Industries. His criminal conviction destroyed any possibility of inheriting or participating in the family business, while the media coverage of his systematic theft from his own father's company made him unemployable in any position requiring financial responsibility or trust. The scandal forced Mr. Morrison to undergo extensive therapy and restructure his estate planning, publicly acknowledging that his son's crimes had nearly destroyed the business he had spent 3 decades building. Bradley's name became permanently associated with one of the most damaging examples of family business fraud in Ohio's corporate history, serving as a cautionary tale about nepotism and the critical importance of proper financial oversight, regardless of family relationships. 6 months later, I accepted the board's unanimous offer to become permanent chief executive officer of Morrison Industries, implementing new financial controls and transparency measures that restored investor confidence and positioned the company for sustainable growth. As I sat in the same office where Bradley had once tried to claim ownership through theft and deception, I reflected on how patience and meticulous documentation had not only protected the company, but elevated my career beyond anything I had previously imagined possible. Sometimes the most satisfying justice comes from allowing criminals to expose themselves completely while you quietly build the unshakable case that will bring them down, proving that integrity and competence will always triumph over entitlement and greed. "Dad left everything to me, not you," Rebecca screamed, her voice echoing through the house I had called home for 15 years. I stood there, clutching Harold's funeral program, still wearing my black dress from the service just 3 days earlier. My heart felt like it had been torn in half all over again. My name is Marianne, and I am 59 years old. Until this moment, I thought I knew my place in this family. Harold and I had been married for 15 years, and I had raised Rebecca since she was 13 after her mother passed away. Now, at 28, she was acting like a stranger who despised everything about me. Harold left specific instructions about how things should be handled, I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. Maybe we should sit down and discuss this calmly. Rebecca's face twisted with fury. There's nothing to discuss. The lawyer already explained everything to me. The house, the money, the investments. It's all mine now. $7 million, and you get nothing. The cruelty in her voice shocked me. This was the same girl I had helped with homework, driven to school events, and comforted through teenage heartbreaks. Where was the gratitude for the woman who had stepped in to mother her when she needed it most? "Rebecca, I'm not trying to take anything from you," I said, reaching toward her. "I just thought we could work together to handle Harold's affairs properly." She jerked away from my touch. "Work together? You were just his second wife. I'm his blood, his real family. You were convenient when he needed someone to cook and clean, but now that he's gone, you're not needed anymore." Her words hit me like physical blows. I had loved Harold deeply, and I thought he had loved me too. We had built a life together, sharing dreams and making plans for the future. I had never thought of myself as just convenient. "Your father and I had many conversations about the future," I began, but Rebecca cut me off. "Stop calling him my father like you have some claim to him. He's dead now, and his daughter inherits everything. That's how it works in real families." I felt tears welling up in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall in front of her. There was something cold and calculating in Rebecca's expression that I had never seen before. It was as if Harold's death had unleashed a side of her that had been hidden all these years. "I think you need to read the will more carefully," I said softly. Rebecca's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Oh, I've read it. Everything comes to me. The only thing you need to worry about is finding somewhere else to live." I retreated to the bedroom I had shared with Harold, my hands trembling as I closed the door. The room still smelled like his cologne, and his reading glasses sat on the nightstand where he had left them. 3 days ago, we had been planning a trip to Europe for our anniversary. Now I was being told to pack my belongings and leave. Harold had been a successful financial advisor who built his wealth through careful investments and smart business decisions. When we met at a community theater production 15 years ago, I was a recent widow trying to rebuild my life. He was a single father struggling to raise a teenage daughter while managing his growing business. We found comfort in each other's company, and eventually love. Rebecca had seemed to accept me at first. She was grieving her mother's death and needed stability. I tried to fill that role without ever attempting to replace her mother's memory. We shared quiet dinners, shopping trips for school clothes, and late-night conversations about her future. I thought we had built a genuine bond over the years, but looking back now, I wondered if Rebecca had simply been tolerating me while waiting for this moment. Had she always seen me as an intruder in her family? Had every kind gesture been an act? I walked to Harold's desk, where he kept important documents. Harold had always been meticulous about legal matters, often spending hours reviewing contracts and financial statements. He frequently mentioned wanting to protect both Rebecca and me, ensuring we would both be cared for after he was gone. "You have to understand," he had told me just 6 months ago. "Rebecca is young and sometimes impulsive. I need to make sure she's truly ready to handle this kind of responsibility." At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. Rebecca worked as a marketing coordinator for a small design firm and seemed to be maturing into a responsible adult. She dated occasionally but hadn't settled down, preferring to focus on her career and social life. Now I was starting to understand what Harold might have seen that I had missed. The way Rebecca complained about having to visit him in the hospital during his final weeks. How she seemed more interested in discussing his assets than spending time with him. The subtle remarks about how much the house would be worth if it were renovated and modernized. A knock at the bedroom door interrupted my thoughts. "Marianne!" Rebecca's voice was sharp with impatience. "I need you to start packing your things. I've already called a contractor about updating this room, and they're coming tomorrow morning." The audacity took my breath away. Her father's body was barely cold, and she was already planning renovations. I opened the door to find Rebecca standing there with her phone in one hand and a notebook in the other. "I'm thinking of expanding the master suite and adding a walk-in closet," she continued, as if she were discussing weekend plans instead of dismantling the life Harold and I had built together. The next morning, I woke to the sound of voices and footsteps throughout the house. Rebecca had indeed called contractors, and they were measuring rooms and discussing renovation plans. The noise felt like desecration, as if she were erasing Harold's presence from his own home. I found Rebecca in the kitchen, surrounded by fabric samples and paint chips, talking animatedly on her phone. "Yes, I want the entire first floor opened up. Money is no object," she was saying. "This house hasn't been updated since the 90s, and it needs to reflect a more modern lifestyle." When she saw me, she ended her call abruptly. "Good, you're up. I need you to clear out Dad's office today. The architect wants to turn it into a wine cellar with a tasting area." A wine cellar. Harold barely drank, and Rebecca's idea of wine appreciation was buying whatever bottle had the prettiest label at the grocery store. "Rebecca, don't you think you're moving too quickly? Your father just passed away 3 days ago. Maybe we should take some time to grieve before making major changes." Her expression hardened. "I don't need grief counseling from you. I've already mourned him. Now I need to move forward with my life. And that means making this house work for me." She walked over to a contractor who was examining the living room walls. "Can we take this wall down completely? I want to create an entertainment space with a large screen television and a bar area." I watched in horror as she casually discussed demolishing the walls that housed Harold's favorite family photos and the built-in bookshelves where he kept his collection of financial journals. These weren't just walls to me, they were memories. "I'm going to the bank this afternoon to start the paperwork for accessing Dad's accounts," Rebecca announced when the contractors stepped outside. "I want to get everything transferred into my name as quickly as possible." "The accounts?" I asked, confused. "Harold always handled our finances jointly. Are you sure there won't be any complications?" Rebecca's smile was condescending. "Marianne, you obviously don't understand how inheritance works. When someone dies, their assets go to their children, not their spouse's second time around. Dad's lawyer explained everything to me yesterday." She pulled out a folder thick with documents. "See? Here's the will, the insurance policies, the investment accounts. It's all very straightforward. $7 million, all going directly to me." I stared at the papers she was waving, noting that she seemed to have only selected portions of the documentation. Harold had always been thorough about legal matters, often creating multiple layers of protection for important decisions. Rebecca, are you certain you have all the documents? Your father was very careful about these things. Of course I have everything, she snapped. What are you implying? That I don't know how to read legal papers? The contractors returned, and Rebecca immediately turned her attention back to renovation plans, dismissing my concerns with a wave of her hand. By afternoon, Rebecca had transformed into a woman I barely recognized. She strutted through the house like she owned a palace, pointing out changes to be made and discussing expensive upgrades with an enthusiasm that felt almost manic. I'm thinking marble countertops in the kitchen, she told one contractor, and maybe we can expand the master bathroom to include a steam shower. I tried one more time to reach the daughter I thought I knew. Rebecca, can we please talk privately? I feel like we're both still processing Harold's death, and maybe we're making decisions too quickly. She turned to me with exaggerated patience, as if I were a slow child. Marianne, I appreciate that you're having trouble accepting the new reality, but this is my house now. I'm not making rash decisions. I'm finally able to make the improvements Dad never wanted to spend money on. Harold was careful with money because he wanted to ensure long-term security for both of us, I replied. Both of us? Rebecca laughed harshly. There is no us anymore. There's me, the heir, and there's you, the woman who happened to marry my father. You got 15 years of living in a nice house and not having to work. That should be enough gratitude for anyone. Her cruelty was breathtaking, but what shocked me more was how calculated it seemed. This wasn't grief talking. This was a plan she had been nurturing for years. Your father loved me, I said quietly. And I thought you cared about me too. Love? Rebecca's voice rose. You were a convenience. Dad needed someone to cook his meals and keep house while he focused on building wealth for his real family. You played house for 15 years, but the game is over now. She gestured toward the contractors, who were pretending not to listen to our conversation. I've got real plans for this place. I'm going to turn it into something worthy of a young professional woman, not some middle-aged widow's cozy nest. The insult stung, but I forced myself to stay calm. What about Harold's wishes? Don't you think we should honor his memory? Honor his memory? Rebecca's laugh was bitter. The best way to honor Dad's memory is to enjoy the wealth he worked so hard to build. He didn't accumulate $7 million so it could sit in boring investments forever. She pulled out her phone and showed me a shopping app with several luxury items in her cart. I'm already looking at a new car. Dad's old sedan is embarrassing. I need something that reflects my new status. I stared at the screen, seeing handbags worth more than most people's monthly salaries and jewelry that cost more than a year of groceries. Rebecca, this kind of spending isn't sustainable, even with a large inheritance. Harold always said, Harold always said, Harold always said, she mocked. Harold isn't here anymore to micromanage every dollar. I'm 28 years old, and I deserve to enjoy life while I'm young enough to appreciate it. She scrolled through more expensive items, adding them to her cart with reckless abandon. Besides, $7 million is more money than I could spend in a lifetime, even living luxuriously. I can afford to renovate this house, buy whatever I want, and still have millions left over. I watched her face as she spoke, seeing an excitement that bordered on fever. She wasn't just planning to spend Harold's money. She was planning to waste it in ways that would have horrified him. What if there are conditions attached to the inheritance? I asked carefully. Rebecca's eyes narrowed. What kind of conditions? I don't know, I admitted. But Harold was always careful about financial decisions. It would be unusual for him to leave such a large sum without some kind of oversight. You're just trying to scare me because you're jealous, Rebecca said, but I noticed a flicker of uncertainty in her expression. That evening, Rebecca's plans became even more grandiose. She called friends, inviting them over to celebrate her inheritance and see the house that would soon be renovated into her dream space. I retreated to Harold's office, the one room Rebecca hadn't yet claimed for demolition. Sitting at his desk, I could almost feel his presence. Harold had been methodical about everything, from his morning coffee routine to his investment strategies. The idea that he would leave such a substantial inheritance without careful planning seemed completely out of character. I began looking through his desk drawers, searching for documents Rebecca might have overlooked. Harold kept meticulous records, and I knew he had worked with his attorney recently to update his estate planning. In the bottom drawer, I found a file labeled Estate Planning Confidential. Inside were several documents I hadn't seen before, including correspondence with the law firm of Morrison, Hayes & Associates. One letter, dated just 2 months before Harold's death, caught my attention. "Dear Mr. Harold," it began, "per your request, we have established the Rebecca Trust Fund with the conditions and restrictions discussed in our meeting. The trust will ensure your daughter learns financial responsibility while protecting both her and your spouse's long-term interests." My hands trembled as I read further. The letter detailed a complex trust structure with very specific conditions. Rebecca would not receive direct access to the inheritance until she turned 35. Until then, all funds would be managed by a trustee, and according to the document, Harold had named me as the primary trustee. I could hear Rebecca and her friends laughing loudly in the living room, their voices carrying through the house as they celebrated what they thought was her windfall. "I'm thinking of taking a year off work to travel," I heard Rebecca saying. "Why should I work some boring job when I'm independently wealthy now?" Another voice asked, "Are you sure you want to quit so quickly? What if there are complications with the inheritance?" "Complications?" Rebecca's laugh was dismissive. "What kind of complications? Dead dad, living daughter, $7 million. It's pretty straightforward." I continued reading the trust documents, discovering layer after layer of conditions Harold had put in place. Rebecca would need trustee approval for any expenditure over $500. She would be required to maintain steady employment or pursue education. Most significantly, the trust included specific language about demonstrating respect for family members and honoring the deceased's values. A separate document outlined Harold's reasoning for these restrictions. He had observed Rebecca's impulsive spending habits and her sometimes selfish behavior. He worried that sudden wealth would destroy her character rather than enhance her life. The trust was designed to help her mature into someone worthy of the inheritance. But there was more. Harold had also included provisions for my own financial security. The trust would provide for my housing, health care, and living expenses for the rest of my life. He had protected both of us, ensuring Rebecca couldn't abandon her responsibilities to the family, while also ensuring I wouldn't be left vulnerable. The final document in the file was a sealed envelope with my name written in Harold's careful handwriting. Inside was a personal letter. "My dear Marianne," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and Rebecca has probably behaved exactly as I feared she would. I know my daughter, and I know she can be cruel when she wants something. I'm sorry you're experiencing this, but please know that I have made arrangements to protect both of you from her worst impulses. The trust will teach her what I was never able to, that wealth without character is meaningless. Be patient with her, but also be strong. You have more power than she realizes." The next morning brought a phone call that changed everything. I was in the kitchen, trying to avoid the chaos of contractors and Rebecca's increasingly elaborate renovation plans, when her cell phone rang. "This is Rebecca," she answered cheerfully, clearly expecting more congratulatory calls from friends. But her expression changed quickly from smug satisfaction to confusion, then to alarm. "What do you mean, frozen?" she demanded. "That can't be right. I'm the sole heir." I watched as her face grew pale, then flushed red with anger. "No, you don't understand. My father left me $7 million. I was just at your bank yesterday discussing the accounts." There was a long pause as she listened to whoever was on the other end of the call. "A trust? What trust? The will said everything comes to me." Another pause, and now Rebecca's hands were shaking. "I need to come in immediately. This is obviously some kind of mistake." She ended the call and stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, staring at her phone as if it had personally betrayed her. "What was that about?" I asked, though I already suspected. Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper. "The bank says the accounts are frozen. They say there's some kind of trust that controls access to the money." She looked at me with wild eyes. "You knew about this, didn't you? That's why you kept asking about conditions and complications." I set down my coffee cup carefully. "I knew your father was thorough about financial planning." "Where are the trust documents?" Rebecca demanded. "I need to see exactly what this means." "I believe they're with Harold's attorney," I replied calmly. Rebecca was already dialing her phone. "Mr. Morrison, this is Rebecca. I need to see you immediately about my father's trust." "What do you mean I should bring Marianne?" She ended the call and stared at me with growing horror. "He says you're the trustee. He says I need your permission to access any significant funds." The contractors chose that moment to return from their lunch break, ready to begin the demolition Rebecca had authorized just hours earlier. "Miss Rebecca?" one of them called out. "Should we start taking down that wall in the living room?" Rebecca looked at the contractors, then at me, then back at the contractors. The reality of her situation was starting to sink in. "How much is this renovation going to cost?" I asked quietly. "About $50,000, she whispered. "And how much money do you have in your personal accounts?" "About $3,000. The lead contractor approached us. "We'll need the first payment before we start any work. That'll be $15,000. Rebecca's face crumbled as the full weight of her situation became clear. She had quit her job that morning, spent her personal savings on a shopping spree, and committed to expensive renovations she couldn't afford, all based on access to money that was now locked away from her. "I need to call them back," she said desperately. "There has to be a way to fix this." But I could see in her eyes that she was beginning to understand. The power dynamic she thought she controlled had just reversed completely. She wasn't the wealthy heiress making demands. She was a 28-year-old woman who had just discovered she was entirely dependent on the stepmother she had tried to throw out of the house. The contractors were waiting for an answer, and Rebecca looked at me with something I hadn't seen from her in years. Genuine fear. "Marianne." Rebecca's voice cracked as she said my name. "We need to talk. Privately." I nodded to the contractors. "Gentlemen, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding about the renovation timeline. We'll need to postpone any work until we can sort out the financing." The lead contractor looked confused, but Miss Rebecca already signed the contract and scheduled us to start today. "I understand," I said calmly, "but circumstances have changed. We'll contact you once we've resolved the financial arrangements." After the contractors left, grumbling about wasted time and delayed projects, Rebecca collapsed into one of Harold's leather chairs. The triumphant, cruel woman from yesterday had been replaced by someone who looked lost and frightened. "Tell me exactly what this trust means," she said quietly. I sat across from her, the trust document spread on the coffee table between us. "Your father created a structure designed to help you learn financial responsibility. Until you turn 35, I control all access to his estate." 35? Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper. "That's 7 years from now." 7 years, I confirmed. "During that time, you'll receive a monthly allowance of $500 for personal expenses. Anything beyond that requires my approval as trustee." Rebecca stared at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language. "But I need more than $500 a month. I can't live on that. Your father assumed you would continue working to support yourself, using the trust fund as supplemental income rather than your primary source of money." "But I already quit my job," Rebecca said desperately. "I told my boss yesterday that I wouldn't be coming back because I was independently wealthy." The irony wasn't lost on me. In her eagerness to claim Harold's fortune, Rebecca had eliminated her own source of income. "The trust also includes provisions for your housing, health care, and education," I continued. "But those funds are released only for approved purposes and only with trustee oversight." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from her since Harold's death. "What do I have to do?" she asked. I looked at the young woman sitting across from me, seeing glimpses of the daughter I had once known buried beneath the greed and cruelty of the past few days. "The trust requires you to demonstrate financial responsibility, maintain steady employment or pursue education, and show respect for family members," I explained. "Your father was very specific about that last requirement." Rebecca winced, clearly remembering her behavior toward me. "There's also a clause about honoring his values and maintaining the family home appropriately," I continued. "Harold loved this house and wanted it preserved, not gutted for trendy renovations." "So you control everything," Rebecca said bitterly. "You get to decide whether I deserve access to my own inheritance." "Your father's inheritance," I corrected gently. "And yes, he trusted me to make decisions that would be in your best long-term interests." Rebecca was quiet for several minutes, processing the reality of her situation. Finally, she looked up at me with something resembling humility. "What happens if I don't meet the requirements?" I consulted the trust documents. "If you fail to comply with the terms, the trust fund will be donated to financial literacy charities, and you'll receive nothing." The color drained from Rebecca's face. "He would really do that? Cut me off completely?" "Your father believed that wealth without character was worthless," I replied. "He structured the trust to ensure you would develop both." Rebecca stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden Harold had lovingly maintained. For the first time since his death, she seemed to be actually thinking about him, rather than his money. "I've been horrible to you," she said without turning around. "Yes," I agreed. "You have been." She turned back to face me, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Can you ever forgive me?" Rebecca faced 7 years of financial dependence on the stepmother she had cruelly evicted, with Harold's trust requiring demonstrated respect, responsibility, and family care before she could access her inheritance. Her attempts to find new employment were complicated by her impulsive resignation and lack of professional references, forcing her to take entry-level positions that barely covered her basic expenses while she waited for trust fund approvals. The expensive car she had ordered was repossessed when she couldn't make the payments, and her social circle gradually distanced themselves as they realized her wealthy heiress status was largely fictional. Her credit suffered as unpaid bills accumulated, and she was forced to move back into her childhood bedroom in Harold's house, living under my oversight and following house rules she had once scorned. The humiliation of explaining to contractors, friends, and colleagues that she had been mistaken about her inheritance damaged her reputation and made her the subject of local gossip about the spoiled daughter who had tried to throw out her grieving stepmother only to discover she needed my approval for everything. As I signed the lease for my comfortable apartment paid for by the trust's provisions for my care, I realized Harold's wisdom had created something more valuable than immediate wealth. He had given Rebecca the opportunity to earn what she received, rather than simply inheriting it without growth, and he had ensured that his love for both of us would continue protecting our family long after his death. Sometimes the most profound revenge is not about punishment, but about teaching someone the true value of what they almost threw away.